Well, thanks very much for the chance to talk to you. Being in contestability, I'm a bit like a deep sea creature, down in the midnight zone. I don't often get out, so it's nice to make a trip outside the Russell complex. In fact, I've found a new travel allowance form I get to fill in for when I move between Russell Building 3 and Russell Building 1 because I'm using quite a bit of shoe leather doing that, but it's great to have a day trip, so thank you again. I'm going to talk about contestability as a function, and I'm going to try and not use this screen, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about the maturing of the capability life cycle and the whole system, and touch on that question of industry policy that Jason sort of teed up for discussion. So first of all, contestability. So as Pat said, he gave a very good overview, I thought, of the capability life cycle process and some of its key features. Contestability came out of the first principles review. It was a core recommendation, and it's about support to better decision making by defence and by government on mainly on capability, but on all big investments. So, and a big purpose of that, identified in the first principles review, as Pat said, was to help rebuild trust with government, including our portfolio ministers, and with central agencies, particularly the Department of Finance and the Prime Minister's Department, in how defence designs and then delivers capability. So the role is an arm's length one, and the division provides critical but constructive analysis and advice to capability managers, so the service chiefs and the Deputy Secretary of Strategic Policy and Intelligence, and also to delivery groups, so primarily the Acquisition and Support Group, the Chief Information Officers Group, and a State and Infrastructure Group, and also to the Investment Committee, which is, as Pat mentioned and others have mentioned, chaired by the Vice Chief, but for the first time has representatives from the Department of Finance and the Prime Minister's Department as full participating members with full access to all the information that every other member of the Investment Committee has. Our function is part of developing advice and proposals for government on all aspects of the capability life cycle. And again, that's new. It covers not just traditional major capability of systems and platforms, but also ICT, state and infrastructure, and intelligence capabilities. They're all part of that same decision process and all part of the integrated investment program. So the first year until now, really, because the division stood up in its new guise in October last year, we've had a dominant focus on the Gate 1 and Gate 2 investment decisions across all aspects of capability. But the first year's also seen the division reach further than projects in two different ways. And the first way is, as Pat mentioned, the shift to program level designing, thinking and decision making rather than individual projects. So much clearer thinking about the linkages between things, the interdependencies in things, and the role that some of those enablers have, which, if you remember, was a really big part of the Defence White Paper to say it's great to have big systems and platforms, but making them all work requires a whole bunch of enablers that the defence organisation has traditionally been bad at prioritising. And we've traditionally, when budget stress comes along, gone to all those enablers and made the savings there, with the state being a good example. But this shift to program thinking means you can't do that anymore, because it's no good having a particular item if it doesn't have the intelligence mission data, or if it doesn't have the workforce, or if it isn't able to be sustained by industry to the levels required to operate it effectively. So a shift to program level thinking and decision making. And Pat mentioned that this is a big shift for ministers. Ministers have often said they lack context. Why am I making a decision on this particular thing? Why am I making a decision on an unmanned aerial system to fly off the back of a patrol vessel? Because we don't get them to make a decision on the particular anchor that the offshore patrol vessel has. Why on the unmanned aerial system? They haven't felt that they've had a picture of what we're actually going to be able to do with these things that we're proposing that they buy. So a program level decision-making approach gives them that context. They can understand more about how things fit together and what options these capabilities will give to government. So it's an important and difficult thing to do well. The other shift that we've done is to work further upstream on the capability life cycle, particularly with force design and interaction with strategy. Pat mentioned keeping things streamlined, keeping things simple was a big part of the first principles review. What's very important when we develop new functions like force design, that we don't do what the former Secretary of Defence said, which is called heavily thatch things. He talked about trying to dethatch all the systems and processes inside defence. So everybody, when something new comes along, they want to have a part of it. Well, a big thing we've been doing with the front end of the force design process is to try and have strategy play a really strong role, but not play that role by producing hordes of new documents. Participate rather than document. Because writing a document doesn't mean anyone pays it attention. It's really, how do you advocate what your thoughts are and what your function is and get it taken up? So keeping things streamlined rather than sort of producing a really dense set of processes is something we've done. But we've also had a small team in the division dedicated to the force design area, and we've for the first time got a place on the Joint Warfare Council, which has been something a little bit arcane in the defence world, particularly to parts of Strategic Policy and Intelligence Group. But it's again chaired by the Vice Chief, and it does important work around concepts, doctrine, capability needs, and joint warfighting issues like the development of the amphibious capabilities, for example. So if it's important to us to affect things early, then it's really important to participate at the force design stage, because we can have a multiplier effect from then on. There's defining work done early that then sort of cascades through the rest of the capability life cycle. What kind of options are developed is really dependent on the experimentation phase. So participating early has been something that we have been doing over this year and will do more of. Our role has been to advocate for clear so whats from proposals, seek streamlining of systems and processes, as I've mentioned, get the capability managers to clearly articulate their priorities early, because broad statements of need become less helpful as you develop solutions. Clearer priorities about what you really want to do and why you really want to do it, and what areas you might be willing to accept risk in, are very, very helpful for people who take those need statements and do something about them. So being clear about that early on. And also advocating for wider program approaches instead of project by project ones. An example, we're buying a large number of guided weapons. When you look across the integrated investment program, well, should we be thinking about guided weapons as a program of activities that relate to particular platforms and systems, rather than buying them in a more sort of penny packet way inside the individual projects? It would do things like simplify the number of foreign military sales cases we have, for example. So working at the force design end does give us that multiplier effect. What's the value that comes out of contestability besides producing a new word for dictionaries, which is always good because English is a living language and it has to grow? But a big value comes because we're agnostic about particular outcomes. And because of that, we bring a different perspective. If you're the Chief of Navy, you've got to love frigates. You can't help it. You can't become the Chief of Navy if you don't love frigates. I mean, I like defence to have capabilities to use in the world when the government wants defence to do things in the world, but I'm agnostic about particular solutions. And that's kind of a really powerful perspective to bring to planning and decision making. So we bring a different perspective from the capability managers, whether they're the service chiefs or the Deputy Secretary for Strategic Policy on Intelligence. And we often see different issues because we look across the span of all of these proposals and all of these activities, from experimentation right through to in-service support. And that span of activity and view, again, is a helpful thing for people that are working in particular parts and particular lanes in the organisation. So how do we provide this analysis, advice and analysis? Well, the big thing is early engagement. So it's not saying, well, when you've done all the work, you come and see me and I'll tell you where you're wrong. It's about being involved from the start as ideas develop, and this has been true for force design's development. So things like the Defence Capability Assessment Program, we've been a part of that, and one of our themes has been keep it simple, keep it fit for purpose, so that the idea of the different speed cycles is a really good one, because sometimes government wants an answer. And we've got to have an approach that does that rather than say, gosh, I wish you'd asked me 4 years ago because I could have started running the machine. So the different speeds, an example of being responsive to government. And as I said, that slimmed down approach with strategy, very important for keeping it workable. But we've also worked closely with capability managers as they think about their capability needs with that clear prioritisation. We provide written advice to capability managers and to the investment committee, and I'm there. Not a formal member, but I sit at the table and I can say whatever I like, subject to the Vice Chief telling me to be quiet. So we've got a fairly powerful place in the system, and putting things in writing is a powerful thing to do as well. If you put it in writing rather than just make a remark, it kind of has to be responded to. And people have said, well, if you do these briefs and they're critical of something, what happens if someone sees one of them? Well, the answer is really simple. If you're being critical but constructive, that should be apparent in what you say. And then if it's been taken into account in the decision, well, what's bad? That's what's meant to happen. So, it's only a negative if you're critical but constructive and it wasn't taken into account in the decision. So if one of these pieces of advice comes out, well, I'm not going to be shy about it, and the investment committee doesn't need to be shy about it because they will have listened, they will have thought about it, and they will have made a decision. That's what I call good policy making. So no surprises. We do not. We don't want to catch people out. We want the results that the government wants from spending 2% of GDP on defence, and we'd like to find the best way of achieving that. So having that common goal with our peers and colleagues in defence and also in the central agencies really is a very big part of the work, because a lot of it is about working relationships. If you're going to be critical, if people know that your goal is getting the result that they want, that makes it work. And we're doing separate work, as I mentioned, for the Joint Warfare Council. So critical analysis can be uncomfortable, so you've got to be clear it's being done for the right reasons. What are we going to do more of over this next year in relation to force design? Well, more independent research and analysis so we can bring different ideas, more cross-stream and program level work, and bringing that into the Joint Warfare Council, and further advocacy of program level planning and implementation that I've mentioned, as well as helping with cost estimation at the early force options stage, because that really helps. I mean, it's not good enough to say, well, I've got this great idea for what we need to do in the future and how, but I'm completely unconstrained by money, because nobody is completely unconstrained by money. So at some early point in options development, the idea of the relative values and costs needs to be brought in. And it's a discipline in the thinking process. And further participation in the defence capability assessment process. So it started well. A particular hobby horse of mine, and Mel would be disappointed if I didn't mention it, is along with gaps and opportunities, gaps in the current investment program and capabilities and opportunities we see, the idea of divestment needs to come up more. It's built into the process, but divestment means recognising what history tells us, that capabilities wax and wane in their utility. Why are we not buying cavalry horses anymore? Why is the knight not a successful combat element now? Well, because technological change has made them redundant. Well, it's good to recognise this in our own thinking and planning rather than wait for it to be manifest at a time when we've overinvested in a whole bunch of stuff. That's called divestment. It's called, if you're in a toy store and you've got your little boy with you and he's got his arms full of toys and he wants something else, well, you've got to get him to put something down so that he can carry something else out. So it's a simple but very difficult thing, because there's a lot of trust in that. Who's going to be the first one to put a toy down to allow someone else to pick something up? At the core of the capability life cycle is the idea of capability change. And that means some disciplined thinking about divestment. Let me give an example, my favourite. It's I call it the Summernats capability example, the M113. So, it's like you buy a 1970 Corolla and you love that car. So what you want to do is display it at Summernats. And every year you spend few $1,000s on it to do something to it. And at the end of it, here you are, it's a 1970s Corolla, and here you are at the 2017 Summer Nats burnout competition. And all of the aficionados at Summer Nats look at your Corolla and they admire the chrome work and the huge wheels and the fact that you've managed to put a V12 from Mel's Mercedes into it. How did you get 6.8 litres of power into that 1970s Corolla? All the aficionados say that, but a bunch of other people walking by say, my God, why did you spend $120,000 on a 1970 Corolla? So there's a case where disinvestment would have helped. And at the M113, I think no one can tell me that we didn't overinvest in a redundant capability for way too long when it should have been manifest to a whole bunch of people. So there's an example. I won't talk about ones in the current force because that would be controversial. But I think that one isn't. And the last thing I was going to mention, maturing of the capability life cycle and industry policy. So the capability managers, the service chiefs and the Deputy Secretary for Strategic Policy and Intelligence have really stepped up as capability managers and realised that, like Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. So they realise they have to make trade-offs. They can't come along and say, oh, guess what, I think I need more money for my armoured vehicle program. And then expect other people to say, well, that's interesting, let's go away and see if we can find you more money. They know if they've got a problem like that, they've got to say, well, looking at my priorities and looking at what I got in this investment program, these are my needs and I need to move more over here, but here's the trade-off that I'm proposing. It's a simple thing, but it's a big thing. And I really do have a lot of respect for the way the capability managers are stepping up to that. Bringing a state and the Chief Information Officers group into the same investment process, that's been what would that be called? A learning journey. It's going well, but it's a really useful thing because we spend billions of dollars in those areas, and bringing that same discipline to there, and also bringing the way they do things to help other people's thinking has been good. And having finance and PM&C openly a part of the decision-making and having access to all that internal defence information. As a bureaucrat that felt very lonely in the Department of Finance and the Prime Minister's Department around supporting National Security Committee decision-making, this makes me very happy because it turns out that being open about the issues and the analysis doesn't hurt at all. In fact, it brings them into the decision-making and it makes them understand things, and they can actually be quite supportive, which is a whole shift in behaviour. So that openness has really worked well. Industry policy, I think Jason's asked a really interesting set of questions there about the relationship between defence industry and economic prosperity. I'll just say one other thing before I get onto that, which is academia and industry. So bringing academia and industry in early in experimentation and force design is essential, but there are a couple of things to think about. So with academia, the benefit of that open, inquiring, researching mind and all of that open research is fantastic. But we've got to balance that with the need to protect insights about technology, capability and security. So a security mindset as that happens and realising when things need to be classified and controlled a little more closely is essential. And I think that's a tricky part of the partnership with large parts of academia from my direct experience working on defence trade controls legislation with them. Industry, again, really valuable for bringing people in early to understand what's actually possible. What are the technologies that they're developing? How do their different systems work together? What's interoperability across them? What is the through life support rationale? That's great to get that in early. And what are the really binding constraints? We can talk about free love between industry and they all cooperate with each other, but we know that's not true. We know there are some real commercial and other constraints in those relationships. So understanding them early is essential. But again, this would be very, very easy to game. If it looks like the industry participants are really there to understand the way a decision is going and then lobby around it, well, that's going to end that kind of early engagement. Or if it looks like they're not being upfront about what the real constraints are, but they're kind of skating over some of those issues, again, that wouldn't be helpful. So there's some real things to be understood in that early engagement. And lastly, industry policy. I'll give a gratuitous piece of contestable advice here. So should we have a strategic defence objective being economic prosperity? Well, let's have a good long debate about that. My view is fairly old-fashioned, which is why does the government invest blood and treasure in the defence portfolio? Well, it does it because it wants Australia to be secure, and if Australia is secure, it's more likely to be prosperous. And as my brother says when he introduces me to people, this is my brother Michael, he works in the harm industry. And I always give a sort of chuckle at that and say, well, I do what I do so that my brother can say these things that he says in a free society. So that's, government invests in defence to keep Australia safe and prosperous, but keeping Australia safe and prosperous means having capabilities that matter. So capability is what the investment is about. And industry, as vital as it is vital because it provides and supports that capability. So it is a means to deliver that capability. It is not a means of itself. That's my view. And a government that is investing 2% of GDP into defence is doing it because it wants, when it turns to defence, it wants to be like the skipper in Madagascar, and it wants defence to be like Kowalski. It turns to defence and says, Kowalski, give me options. So I'll leave it with that. But thank you very much for your attention.